Bueno, arratsaldeon danori, hasiko gara orain hirugarren saioarekin. Eta beno, in this session we are joined by Robert Brenner, economic historian, professor emeritus of history, and director emeritus of the Center for Social Theory and Comparative History at the University of California, Los Angeles, and also author of books such as The Economics of Global Turbulence, which is also published in Spanish by ACAL. We do also have Marcel van der Linden, expert in global labor history, also professor emeritus, dedicated to the history of social movements at the University of Amsterdam, and also director of research at the International Institute of Social History until 2014. And of course, also author of books such as Western Marxism and the Soviet Union. So, well, we have invited both of them to talk about the relation between capital accumulation cycles and class struggle. This is the relation between the economic situation or economic tendencies and the forms of subjectivity or consciousness. Well, the Marxist concern about this relation is not trivial, especially because the form of exploitation of the labor power commodity shapes the ways in which the working class resists and struggles. Since this relation must be clarified in order to think rigorously about the revolutionary strategy of communism. In that sense, it has often been argued that a strategy ceases to be effective when its explanatory capacity does not correspond to the new state of things created by the capital relation. This was a very important issue for Lenin as well. In many of his significant writings, for example, his economic studies of the development of capitalism in Russia, or even in his studies of imperialism, these studies could be understood as approaches to this relation between accumulation and forms of class struggle. Yodidin talked this morning about Lenin's analysis of the Russian society's class composition, paying special attention, of course, to the industrial and agrarian proletariat, and it's important in political and organizational terms. But Lenin did not analytically reveal the nature of this relationship between accumulation of capital and class struggle. He only came to present them as a political synthesis. This is as readings of the current situation to which a strategy and a party model correspond. In other words, he might have intended to translate into strictly organizational terms the specific class character of a given organic composition of capital, as well as the future projections of its value composition and technical composition. And now I will give the word to the speakers, who will now discuss the possible links between capital accumulation and class struggle, in order to assess the analytical validity of this relation and its capacity to explain the reality. So, please, Robert.
Thanks very much. Usually, when you're speaking to an audience that's new to you, and you're new to them, you say something like, "It's really great to be here, and it's wonderful to meet you people, and I've learned a lot of things. You say that no matter what, but in this case, I have to emphasize it's all the case. I mean, it's been, even the short time we've been here, it's been me and Susie Weissman. It's really been a great trip, and we've not only enjoyed it, but we've learned a lot, and maybe above all for us, we've had some very exciting political conversations that seem to promise some very positive developments here in the Basque Country and maybe the rest of Spain. I mention it because while I think, you know, the people on this platform, especially this guy, have been for a long time involved in politics and, you know, can't think of doing life, so to speak, without it, it's not been the most fun thing to do, because you know, to use a stupid economics term, there's been ever declining returns to political activity. And it's really gratifying to see that being reversed these days. I would say since around 2000, what I've seen, I don't know if Marcel has the same experience or you guys have, is that there is a new excitement about political action, and I think it hasn't yet really had too much of a payoff, though we know, you know, the big events around 2009-10 at the time of the Great Recession, similarly again around 2020, there's definitely been much more than stirrings. But seeing people come out here who are not academics for the most part, and who are here because they think learning stuff and talking to each other about stuff and not accidentally helping to build their political organization as part and parcel of that, you know, that it is beginning to make a dent, begin to make a payoff. There's not much, you know, you don't want to exaggerate that at all. And if you're doing politics with that as you know, the payoff as your premise that you will have a payoff, you should find another business. But I think Spain has always been a little different in this respect, and it's great to be here to see it. The particular sort of way, that kind of topic of my talk is the paradox of financialization and the transformation of politics. Now, during the last 40 years or so, the financial sector, as most people know, has rocketed to a dominant position in the US political economy, one of a series of interconnected developments that have transformed the global system beyond recognition. Today, finance occupies an outsized, perhaps too prominent, place in analytical and imaginative portrayals of contemporary life. It's at the center. But its ascent has been viewed, in my opinion, as too natural, all too inevitable, while its paradoxical, even self-contradictory character has been insufficiently recognized. Mainstream economists and radical economists alike, although in different ways, have all too often sought to understand financialization by assimilating it to long-term patterns of economic evolution at the core of their own particular paradigms. In the case of the economists, the movement from agriculture to industry to services. In the case of in the case of radical economists, the rise of finance capital. So that progression, I associate it with not just economists, mainstream economists, but sort of mainstream social science for a long, long time, and equally the rise of finance and financialization has been at the center of radicals' interests, certainly back to Hilferding, Lenin, all that I think people are going to or have already been talking about here. But financialization actually needs to be grasped not as a natural development in those processes of economic transformation determined by more or less objective developments, but as an outgrowth of the quite specific evolution of the post-war world economy, particularly the shift from long boom to long downturn that took place roughly between 1965 and 1975. The deepening stagnation and crisis of the real economy that followed, and perhaps above all, the abject failure of US policymakers who were committed to the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis to reverse the downturn, despite doing everything possible to do that and making every possible, making every possible effort. The U.S.'s world-beating manufacturing sector had carried the U.S. economy to a position of unchallenged global dominance in the decades between the Civil War and the end of the 19th century, and kept it there through the greater part of the 20th century, as it took an increasing share of total U.S. output, plant and equipment, labor force, and profits. As late as the mid-1960s, manufacturing yielded 40% of U.S. private sector profits, while making up 32% of the private sector labor force. There was no industry that remotely rivaled it in terms of its centrality for the U.S. economy. Nevertheless, in the years immediately following, and shockingly discontinuously, between the mid-60s and late 70s, manufacturing quite suddenly experienced such a serious deceleration of investment, employment, and GDP growth, rooted, our favorite causal variable in the decline in the rate of profit in that period, that finding alternative fields of profitable expansion became indispensable if the U.S. economy was to regain its former dynamism and reaffirm its predominance. So the rise of the U.S. had been pretty closely, it was almost equivalent to the rise of American manufacturing, over a long, long period, almost back to the Civil War, and without any serious discontinuity, except, of course, things like World Depression, which affected everything. But manufacturing in the U.S. and the U.S. economy was on the upswing for a very long time. But as I said, and as you guys know, from the mid-60s onward to the later 70s, a shift out of manufacturing did begin and ultimately occur as part and parcel of a broad restructuring of the economy. And the ascent of the financial sector, or at least leading elements within it, took place more or less parallel to it. I think people kind of intuitively know this, even if they're not quite too sure, as I have not been, exactly what goes on in finance. You know, trying to study this is like a whole new obscure continent that I myself had never learned much about, and it's quite a challenge. But nonetheless, what we've seen is the shift out of manufacturing, clearly, and into finance, which went hand in hand. By the turn of the millennium, annual financial profits had tripled as a share of total private sector profits, rising from around 10% in 1980 to 30% in 2000. That's, you can, you know, think of, if you guys ever, you know, look at economic statistics in this aggregate way, you realize pretty quickly how, you know, how important small percentage point shifts in one direction or another are. And here we're talking about a 20 percentage point increase in 20 years. And finance overtook manufacturing as the industry yielding the most profits. In the following 7 years after 2000, that led in, of course, into the Great Recession. The financial sector only deepened its dominance, and in spectacular fashion, while the manufacturing sector saw its share of private sector profits fall by a further 1/3. Yet precisely the fact that this epochal shift did take place, that finance exploded upward into the firmament at the same time that the real economy stagnated and declined, poses a fundamental question, almost built into that idea of real economy, whatever that is. How could the real economy fall so dramatically or decline so dramatically as part of the economy at the same time that finance rose, ascended? That is what we call a problem, or if we want to be impressive, we call it a contradiction, and people, lefties tend to listen to us more, but, I don't know if it helps. I have to say, just talking about this question, I kind of came late to study this, and I have not found it particularly easy, mainly because of the terminology, the new terminology, not because it's rocket science. So I think if things become a little fuzzy or unclear, it's very likely because of the vocabulary and the terminology. So, I think people should, not back off very quickly. There's nothing terribly, difficult about it, but at least for some of us, for me, for example, it was quite new, so not so easy at the start. Okay, so sorry. The precipitous decline of, so anyway, to answer the question about this contradictory development of the rapid rise of finance paralleled by the rapid decline of manufacturing as shares of the fundamental parts of the economy, labor force, profits, etc., what I'll try to be doing for the rest of this paper. I doubt if I'll finish the talk, but I think you'll see the problem unfolding. And I think if you see the problem unfolding, then you'll get it. You'll get what needs to be understood, and you may find that you don't agree with how I'm trying to understand it, but you'll see what needs to be, so to speak, what needs to be done. Anyway, the precipitous decline of manufacturing in terms of these basic indicators, profit rate, capital accumulation, employment, output increase, delivered a devastating blow to the economy as a whole, its profitability and growth. And in the 3 decades leading up to the Great Recession of 2007-2009, the non-financial economy, that is, the whole economy outside of finance, in which manufacturing had been so prominent, experiencing ever worsening slowdown, continuing the trend that had prevailed in much of the latter part of the 20th century. God, it's hard to think of. You always, at least I, always think of the last century as being the 19th, but already we're well into the 21st. This goes with the territory. Nevertheless, during the same period that this decline in manufacturing and the non-financial economy overall occurred, at the same time, the financial sector enjoyed a spectacular ascent. U.S. capitalists, by virtue of finance, were thereby able to sustain their position of global preeminence, but doing so at the very same time that the global economy foundered clearly constitutes a puzzle, which is that the same difficulties of the real economy that made the rise of finance a welcome, even necessary development, seemed to make it an impossible one. So that is, the rise of finance occurring at the same time as the decline in the heart of industry just doesn't make sense in standard economic terms. And I hope that by the time I've completed this, which has gotten far enough into this, you'll see that how overwhelming that contradiction is, and how important to deal with it is to understand the rise of finance. For a long period, the U.S.'s commercial banks, and so the background of this is a situation where it wasn't contradictory, of course. For a long period, the U.S.'s commercial banks, at the heart of the country's financial sector, had the U.S.'s industrial and commercial firms as their primary customers, working with them on an intimate basis and helping them to finance their projects. This partnership drove the post-war boom, that is, a partnership between finance and industry. And when the country's leading corporations rapidly multinationalized their operations, starting in the 1950s, the country's leading banks followed them abroad to continue to provide them loans and other financial services. Throughout the length of the upturn, most U.S. industries and regions enjoyed high rates of profit, and the U.S.'s leading depository institutions, these banks, especially the great New York money center commercial banks, achieved, as a result of that ascent of the non-financial economy, exceptionally elevated rates. So there's a symbiosis that you would expect between finance and industry. The bank's profits, as well as the profits of industrial and commercial firms that they serviced, were amplified by reduced costs of borrowing, that is, reduced interest rates, that they were enabled to pay for their funds. The banks had, and everybody in the economy actually, had lower than expected rates of interest thanks to the interest rate ceilings that on their deposits that were imposed by the Federal Reserve with its famous Regulation Q. The aim was to subordinate the needs of the mainly better-off U.S. households who accounted for most of the country's household savings directly as well as indirectly through mutual funds, pension funds, and insurance funds to the needs of the alliance of great corporations and great banks that held the fate of the post-war economy in their hands. So, alliance of finance, big industry, and government. That was the, a triple threat that drove the American economy in most of its ascent. And this combination delivered historic rates of profit, capital accumulation, and growth for 3 decades after World War II. Nevertheless, from the from the end of the 30s, I should say. Nevertheless, from the middle 1960s, as the U.S. non-financial economy, especially manufacturing, found itself decreasingly able to sustain rates of profit, investment, and expansion that it had maintained from the time of World War II, as that happened, it unleashed a long series of initiatives aiming in collaboration with the government to restore industrial dynamism. And these efforts ultimately were what posed the problem for this paper. You'll see that it's a big issue, and I'll only be able to kind of begin to get into it. But I think the key thing is that you see the problem, because what you have is the unintended effect of transforming the real economy's relationship to the financial sector was propelling the financial sector into profound crisis that threatened its very ability to reproduce itself. These developments opened the way, although they emphatically did not cause the ascent of the totally and massively aggrandized financial sector that has come to power before our eyes. A lot of words there. I hope I didn't lose you. Simple point. The finance transcended the problems of the economy that had really began in the late 60s, at the very same time that manufacturing continued into descent. Now, the fall of the rate of profit of the non-financial economy, rooted in the decline of manufacturing profitability, had as its fundamental result the decline in surpluses available to companies to invest and a decline of companies' investment opportunities. And these together brought about understandably, a sharp fall in the rate of growth of plant and equipment and employment as well. Meanwhile, capitalists across the board unleashed an attack on workers and their institutions, which succeeded in sharply reducing the increase of wages, and in this way undercut rising household purchases, or the speed of household purchases of consumer goods, while governments came to the aid of capital by cutting social expenditures and government spending in general, ultimately paving the way for corporate tax cuts. So a shrinking of government, at least in relative terms, at the same time as the continuing rise of finance. These reductions in spending amounted to reductions in the growth of demand for capital goods, for consumer goods and government services, a decline in the growth of aggregate demand that loomed henceforth like a dark cloud over the whole economy. The secular long-term weakening of aggregate demand brought about the continuous decline of every major indicator of macroeconomic performance, decade by decade, business cycle by business cycle, from the 70s right up to the present, with profound implication for the fate of the financial sector. Just as a slowdown in the growth of aggregate demand, deriving from the fall and failure to recover of the non-financial rate of profit led to, this famous term, secular stagnation, our friend Larry, and eventually the crisis of the non-financial economy, the deceleration of the real economy could not but bring about powerful downward pressure on the financial sector. So this is what I've been sort of leading into, that as the, quote, real economy is under pressure and begins to contract, so does the financial sector, which doesn't sound like what the trend of this paper, or the subject of this paper. With the growth of their surpluses and profit opportunities in decline, the industrial and commercial corporations that constituted the main customers of the leading commercial banks were able to generate only decreasing demand for those banks' loans. Under intensified pressure to cut costs so as to counteract downward pressure on their rates of return, those same industrial corporations move increasingly to directly finance their activities on what was, here's one of those technical terms, commercial paper market, rather than by way of commercial banks on which they long depended. This is just to say that they had used the banks as their lenders, but as they became under pressure to cut costs in any way possible, they shockingly moved against these middlemen. So, and the way they did it was instead of letting the banks carry out the financial service for them, they cut that out and did it themselves. The consequence was that the commercial banks, and especially the great New York money center banks, saw the call or demand for their loans and services plunge. This is just what we'd expect. All else equal, pressures emanating from the real economy should have caused the financial sector to shrink and correspondingly to be hit by reduced rates of return. Rather than, that's what would have been expected by the famous common sense. Rather than to initiate the epoch-making ascent of finance that actually took place. The question then was, how could a real economy undergoing this famous secular stagnation leading to crisis drive the extraordinary expansion of the financial sector that actually took place? The answer simply is that it could not. But if the non-financial economy could not underpin financial expansion as it was slowing down, this left only the financial sector to underpin the expansion of the financial sector. But as doesn't take, again, astrophysics, an autonomously self-expanding financial sector is at bottom of a contradiction in terms, because what finance is about is serving one after another of the industries in the economy. So now, in order to counter the downward pressure on their profits that resulted from the declining demand for their loans and other services from the real economy, individual financial firms really had only one way to go. This was to turn to increasingly dangerous investments, perilous investments that had the potential, because they were so risky, to yield higher rates of profit due to their increased riskiness, and or the decreased capital and increased debt as a proportion of the total money invested. This was a strategy that might allow individual firms to more than compensate for the reduced rates of return they were stuck with as a result of declining profitability, declining dynamism, and declining demand for their loans and other financial services from the non-financial economy. But they were not tactics that succeed for financial firms in aggregate, that is, the financial sector as a whole. Profit rates that were maintained by taking greater risks obviously amounted to lower profit rates calculated on a risk-adjusted basis. So what we're basically saying is you're kidding yourself if you think that you can get higher returns by doing pretty much the same kind of thing but has higher risk attached to it. So virtually by definition, financial investors were consigned as a group to reduce profitability. So this is like half of what I'm more than half of what I'm trying to, present. That is what we're really kind of would have thought we were dealing with was a falling rate of profit in finance, paralleling the falling rate of profit in manufacturing and much else of the real economy. Rates that were maintained through putting up less capital compared to credit as a percentage of total financial investment, that is, relying on greater leverage, did endow the individual investors who did this with the hope, the possibility of warding off reduced rates of return on the money that they advanced by way of lower rates of return, or the average rates of return on their total investment. So if you're doing riskier things, you should expect reduced rates. But it also reduced rates of return. But it also left the individual investor correspondingly more, it shouldn't be a but there, vulnerable to insolvency if returns on total investment fell below the level necessary to cover the capital advance plus the borrowed funds. So elevated gains an individual investor might secure through making high-risk investments. You should get a better return on your investment if it's higher risk, precisely because looking at the thing as a whole, you're really not getting a higher rate of return because the likelihood of your getting that return is less. So by putting up less capital and more borrowed money as portions of their total investment could not be generalized. That was not something that in the economy could be done by a phalanx of investors, and all of them could succeed. Because in effect, what brought about higher returns or elevated returns or better than average returns were not risk adjusted. So what that meant was that if you take risk into account, there were lots of firms that could be expected to get into trouble. And that is exactly what happened. Fact remains that as individual financial firms found it increasingly difficult to profit as they had previously increasingly difficult to profit as much as they previously had during a long epoch by nurturing long-term direct relations with non-financial corporations, so as to position themselves to finance and otherwise service their products. They found themselves with little choice but to concentrate increasingly on the markets for financial assets, stock markets, bond markets. This was precisely because by making speculative one-time trades and other comparable transactions on these markets, they secured themselves the best opportunity to make those higher rates of profit, to make those higher rates of profit better, in other words, the opportunity to make higher returns than they could have by catering to the needs of the non-financial economy. Simply put, if you want to make a lot of money, you speculate. And you can't, and that's the way to make the best return. But that means that so-called risk-adjusted returns will, in parallel manner, decline. So those markets offered, as it turned out, not surprisingly, lower rates of return on average in the aggregate. So financial firms could not but attempt to make their profits by doing business with one another on markets for financial assets, some by speculating in financial assets and financing that speculation largely by borrowing, some by lending to leverage speculators, some by taking fees to facilitate that speculating. But you see the point. It's all within the financial sector. It's shifting around the same amount of profit to the degree some win, others lose, because the finance is both on the customers and the sellers. So this was clearly a circular process in which the profits of one financial agent could come in the normal course of things only at the expense of another, offering no way to raise the return for all of them taken together. Since firms on these markets base themselves to such a large extent on investment financed by borrowing, debt, which banks could, of course, create out of old cloth, the losses of some of them could easily outdistance the profits of the rest, making for catastrophic losses for the financial sector as a whole. This would not only invite financial instability and financial meltdown, but it could easily pose a threat of crisis for the economy as a whole, while requiring government rescues as a standard return. I think if people think for a second, you realize that's going to be the story of that period, one bailout after another. And I foreshadow that, as if I'm telling you a mystery story, because I don't think I'm going to get too much further in this talk because I'm running out of time. But since they had to turn for their profits increasingly to speculation and decreasingly in lending to other service firms in the non-financial economy, financial firms, all else equal, could not avoid the same downward trend that was confronting the non-financial corporations. As aggregate demand from companies and households fell, the result, all else equal, had to be long-term decline in their demand for loans, and therefore, all else equal, a long-term decline in the rate of interest, that is, the return to lenders. The rate of return on lending, and therefore on financial investment in general, fell steadily from its peak in 1984 through the Great Recession of 2000 through 2009 and beyond. The upshot was that the financial investors who relied ever increasingly on trading financial assets, along with the associated lending to support that trading, as well as charging fees, had to make ever more dangerous, ever more highly leveraged, highly more speculative investments if they were have a hope of declining returns. But the strategy of stepped up speculation obviously could not provide a way forward for large numbers of financial firms, let alone the financial sector as a whole for any extended period of time. So the financial sector could not avoid facing the same. Okay, in 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. It was that. So I'm sorry. The financial sector could not avoid facing the same tendency to declining returns, declining profits, that is, and slowing expansion that was plaguing the real economy. It's what you'd expect. It was certainly not an economic environment that could promise the epoch-making takeoff of financial profits. Since it became necessary for financial firms to take ever higher risk, employ greater leverage to secure decent profits, financial firms were driven or themselves to fashion alternative ways of profit. Since declining opportunities to profit from loans and services to the real economy was the source of their problem in the first place, what had originally forced them into the markets for financial assets, so what that means is investing in bond market, stock market, rather than investing in lending to auto companies or steel companies and so forth. Doing that successfully was no easy task. What turned out to be financial companies' most promising alternative was to put themselves in a position to decrease reliance on high risk, high leverage investing by way of charging fees for underwriting deals in which others invested and provided the loans. If one could get together large enough deals on a regular basis, the sky was the limit for financial profits. There was, however, one major catch, and you probably don't have to guess what it is. To be able to profit from charging big fees, there had to exist a rapidly expanding field for increased financial investment, and that in turn increased lending to financial investors that offered high rates of profit. But precisely the difficulties of making a good rate of return by investing in financial assets or by lending to financial investors, reflected in the high risk and high leverage required, made the efflorescence of financial investing so problematic. Giant profits in firms for arranging financial sector deals were certainly quite conceivable in the abstract. And eventually they turned out to constitute an especially lucrative way forward for the top managers of leading financial companies, notably in investment banking. But this was only on the premise that the financial sector, or at least leading elements within it, could somehow experience takeoff when the real economy was in stagnation and crisis. We are, in other words, back to our original problem. You'll have to tune in next week to get the answer to this mystery. Hopefully, I'll have a chance to say if I'll immediately when we get to the question period, I'll detour a little bit of it to finish this this point. But it's simple to finish it in general. What was needed to make for the efflorescence of finance in the face of the decline of industry was not economic at all. It was power and politics, and sort of tune in next week.
Okay, so now Marcel will have the word.
Okay. Let me start by endorsing what Bob said when he began his talk about how welcome we feel here and so. And let me add that I see in Europe a number of countries where young people are radicalizing and building new organizations. And we see it in Norway with Rødt, we see it in the Netherlands where the youth organization of the Socialist Party was expelled and they started their own organization, which I joined. I see it here. Yes, of course, I'm one of the oldest members, as you can imagine. Anyway, so let us begin with my talk. It's about, I had prepared a PowerPoint, but unfortunately, you cannot show a PowerPoint here, which is amazing in such a posh building. But anyway, the talk is about Lenin, dying capitalism, and the global crisis of labor movements. So it's not an optimistic speech, although at the end there is some hope coming. World War I was, as we know, a turning point in many ways. One important change became visible in the economic analysis of the revolutionary left. Very clear was this with Lenin. Building on the work of Bukharin, Hilferding, and Hobson, he saw an extensive and probably irreversible decline of world capitalism. The rapidly increasing power of the monopolies since the 1880s began, in his view, to culminate in a new stage of development, what he called imperialism. The essence of imperialism, he wrote in 1917, is, I quote, a combination of antagonistic principles, that is, competition and monopoly. Monopolistic competition leads to incessant global expansion of commodity production and competition and results in an intensified struggle for raw materials and sales areas. And then Lenin says an increasing number of small or weak nations is exploited by a handful of the richest and most powerful nations. But these monopolist tendencies simultaneously engender a tendency to what he calls stagnation and decay. After all, as soon as monopoly prices are established, even temporarily, he says the motive cause of technical and consequently of all other progress disappears to a certain extent, and further, the economic possibility arises of deliberately retarding technical progress. One of the consequences of this is that the bourgeoisie is, according to Lenin, to an ever-increasing degree, living on the proceeds of capital exports and by clipping coupons. Maybe you don't know how to clip coupons, but it's lucrative. Therefore, imperialism has to be characterized as what he calls a parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism, capitalism which is dying but not dead. However, Lenin also warned against seeing this development as a homogeneous tendency. This whole development does not transform capitalism from top to bottom, but sharpens its contradictions, and it does not preclude the rapid growth of capitalism at the same time. Now, with this analysis, Lenin initiated the debate on the general crisis of capitalism that was to dominate left-wing thinking on the development of capitalism for decades. A debate to which, of course, his early death meant he could contribute little further later. As early as 1922, Jenő Varga, also known as Eugen Varga, who would later become Stalin's chief economist, published a book called The Period of Capitalist Decline. In the years that followed, numerous contributions were discussing this theme by Marxists of various persuasions. For instance, in 1930, Henrik Grossman published his influential study on the law of accumulation and breakdown of capitalism. And a few years later, Leon Trotsky spoke in his transitional program of the death throes of capitalism. Even non-Marxists felt that capitalism's collapse might be approaching. Well known is the fact that shortly after the Second World War, the liberal economist Joseph Schumpeter said that there was a tendency towards decomposition in capitalist society, and this would inevitably lead to the dissolution of capitalism. Up until the early 1950s, in general, we can say that almost no one believed in a longer upswing as a real possibility. There are some exceptions. Some people who supported this idea of Kondratiev about the long waves, so that means that after a long period of decline, there must be another period of an upswing. But in general, Marxists and non-Marxists were very pessimistic about the world economy. I cannot go now into the numerous theoretical variants developed over time. Rather, I want to say something more about the links between theory as such and strategic discussion in the labor movement. The question to ask then is, how was the connection between economics and revolutionary politics seen in the movements? According to the Marxist tradition, of course, it is taken for granted that all modes of production and all social formations have a beginning and an end. That is also why capitalism will not have an eternal life. But how will capitalism find its Waterloo? Marx himself worked with two different theoretical approaches that have been called the esoteric and the exoteric argumentation. According to the esoteric approach, capitalism will finish itself. You know the famous sentence in Capital, the true barrier to capitalist production is capital itself. How this would work, how capitalism would finish itself, Marx has different suggestions over the course of his life. For instance, in the Grundrisse, he writes that the progressing reduction of living labor in productive processes, so let's say automation, leads to the breakdown of exchange. Because increasingly everything is becoming constant capital, and if there's only constant capital, then there is no living labor to exploit anymore, and this leads to the total collapse of the profit rate also. Elsewhere, for instance, in a letter to Friedrich Engels in 1858, he argued that the creation of the world market would be capitalism's endpoint. He says, now that capitalism is almost everywhere in the world, capitalism can no longer expand, and we can expect soon a revolution in Europe. So that is the esoteric approach. The exoteric approach, these terms are from a German sociologist, philosopher, Stefan Breuer, and have been used a lot in Hegel studies, by the way. The exoteric Marx considered the proletariat as the class whose historic task it would be to overthrow the capitalist mode of production and to finally abolish all classes. Marx sought to depict both approaches, the esoteric and the exoteric, in a logical context. And he did not see a contradiction between the two because as labor movements began to flourish during his life, this became more and more plausible, that both the collapse from itself and from inside and the push from outside would both be complementary. During the revolutionary wave that washed over the world between 1916 and 1921, roughly, the socialist movements also did not feel they had to choose between the two perspectives. Precisely during the years when imperialism emerged, the labor movement also began to gain considerable strength. This is clearly evident, for example, in the growth of the trade union movement. And here I had in my PowerPoint a beautiful table for you on union membership as a percentage of the labor force in a number of countries. And you see that between 1905 and 1950, in Australia, the organizational degree increases from 10 to 50%, in Austria from 3 to 40%, and so on and so on. Spain is not included in my table. Precisely from the point of view of the general crisis of capitalism about which Lenin was talking, the esoteric perspective of collapse and the exoteric perspective of the insurrectionary push seem to more or less coincide. And only in such a short historical period, I think, can a genuinely revolutionary organization achieve the allegiance of large masses whose struggle for immediate, indispensable interests also go beyond the framework of the capitalist system. In the years that followed, let's say after 1921-22, this changed. In the absence of an acutely revolutionary situation, revolutionaries were faced with the task of walking a tightrope between the two abysses. So on one hand you can drop that, and on the other hand you can also drop that, and you have a small way in between. And so the right abyss was reformist opportunism. We have already heard a lot about opportunism. And the left abyss was sectarianism. In the developed industrialized world, of course, the working masses are generally, on average, reformist at the most. If the Communist Party wants to gain their trust, it must legitimize itself as a successful champion of reform. In doing so, it all too easily becomes a mere part of the system it has set out to destroy. It becomes the left wing of capitalism. We have seen this many times, of course, in the course of history. If, on the other hand, the party renounces a long and serious struggle for reforms, it will either become a sect that disguises its powerlessness with revolutionary phraseology, or, driven by impatience, it will fall into putschist adventures. And this we also have seen a number of communist parties, for instance, who try to realize socialism by putsch. So in line with this, Lenin viewed the proletarian revolution from a double perspective. When there was evidence of mass radicalism, as in Russia in the autumn of 1917, he opted for an immediate communist seizure of power. But when popular revolutionary ferment was on the decline, as in Europe after 1921, he adopted a more gradualist strategy in which piecemeal reforms became acceptable in the short run as the most expedient means of winning mass support. The debate on this gradualist strategy was held in several places. It also led to the invention of the concept of the transitional demands, and was, for instance, very crucial in the debate in the Italian Communist Party in the late 1920s. So even after World War II, the vast majority of the Marxists initially remained convinced that the decline of capitalism would continue. As late as 1948, just to give you one example, the German Communist Party assumed that the increased power of the Soviet Union, the emergence of other socialist countries, the crisis of the colonial system, and the contradictions within the capitalist camp had led to what it called an extraordinary deepening of the general crisis of world capitalism. There were, however, as I already mentioned briefly, certainly Marxists also who thought that the decline of capitalism did not have to be sustainable. They included supporters of Nikolai Kondratyev, the theorist of the long waves, and for example also Edward Sard, an American Trotskyist economist who in early 1944, so while the war was still going on, had already prophesied that after the war an arms race would begin, implying a rapid growth of the US economy and a drastic reduction of unemployment. It took, however, until the early 1950s before such theories were taken seriously in wider circles. The long post-war boom necessitated a reconsideration of the general capitalist crisis. So let's say from the mid-50s until the 70s, you have an enormous boom in capitalism almost everywhere. This period, which the French call les 30 glorieuses, the glorious 30 years, although it's not entirely 30 years, also heralded the beginning of the end of the traditional labor movements. And now I come to the sad part of the story. This beginning of the end of the traditional labor movements became visible in the 1940s and 50s as a first thing with the consumer cooperatives. Like all businesses under capitalism, they were increasingly forced to centralize and to concentrate capital due to improved transportation facilities and new retail forms, supermarkets and things like that. So this trend manifested itself partly in the declining number of cooperatives and in the increasing membership strength per cooperative unit. Often the average age of consumer cooperative members rose as elderly members remained loyal to their cooperatives and younger ones failed to materialize. And the few that continue to exist, like KF in Sweden, which is still the second largest retailer in that country, they bureaucratized so much that inside the cooperative there have been a number of wildcat strikes of employees. So they didn't consider this their own organization anymore. No. In the same period of the 1950s already you see the beginning of the decline of some other types of organizations. For instance, the French Communist Party had its high point around 1946, 47, and then it started with, well, went down until 2007, and then they stopped participating independently in elections. And many communist parties show a similar pattern. So the crisis, I come back to this, the crisis of many communist parties is not due to the collapse of the Soviet Union or so, but started much earlier. After the long boom ended, so let's say in the 1970s, the decline of the unions and worker parties began to become more general. In most countries with independent workers' organizations, union density, so the percentage of workers that is organized in unions, has been declining. On a global scale, union density is almost insignificant now. Independent trade unions organize only a very small percentage of their target group worldwide, and the majority of them live in the relatively wealthy North Atlantic region, so here. According to an estimate of the International Trade Union Confederation from 10 years ago already, global union density for the whole world amounted to no more than 7%. Since then, unions in most parts of the world have continued to lose members, so that global union density may by now approach 6 or perhaps 5%. Labour, social democratic and communist parties are not doing very well electorally. Here I had another beautiful table, which I cannot show you, about 18 social democratic and Labour parties from 1920 to 2019, and where you see that almost all these parties were losing a percentage, were going down in percentage-wise with the elections in the period until before 1990, roughly. And there's a few exceptions, especially here in the south of Europe, but there it also stopped. And the only exception in 2010 still was Canada, but that's now also stopped. So all social democratic and Labour parties are now on a downward road. Communist parties in non-communist countries are the second major political form. Most of them are having a hard time. In quite a few countries, the parties have been dissolved after electoral decline, or have undergone splits, or have gone financially bankrupt, as in Finland, for instance. And even the CPIM, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, in West Bengal, which received the majority of the votes in a whole series of elections from the 1970s until 2011, has now been reduced to a minor player in parliament because of its violent neoliberal policies. All in all, the downturn of the old labor movement seems to be almost all-embracing. Now, at the same time, however, global capitalism is in trouble, and Bob has already said a lot about this. Since the beginning of the Great Recession of 2008, awareness has generally taken hold that the years of rapid economic growth are over. Already in 2016, the journal Foreign Affairs devoted an entire issue under the motto, "How to Survive Slow Economic Growth." Even earlier, a report published by the OECD in Paris argued that growth expectations for the coming decades are rather mediocre. While growth continued more in emerging economies, they wrote, than in the OECD countries, it would be slowed by gradual exhaustion in the race to catch up and the less favorable demographics in all other countries. Moreover, influential authors such as Meghnad Desai, Robert Gordon, Paul Mason, Wolfgang Streeck are of the opinion that capitalism has lost its momentum or even reached its final phase. Now, surveying this period, since Lenin wrote his book on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it seems that the thesis contained in that work of Lenin's has become curiously inverted by the reality of the last century. To see that, we must first of all note that the period between the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the crisis of 1974 was the period that was historically extraordinary. We have seen that the capitalism was in crisis since World War I, but then we see a revival of capitalism for these 50 years or so. And the period from 1929 to the 1970s constituted a significant divergence from the trends unleashed by the industrial and transportation revolution of the 19th century. And then after this period, since the 1970s, we see a return of the world to 19th century trends and their associated financial turbulence, culminating in the 2007-2009 systemic crisis. The changes of the years 29 to 74 obviously had a prelude and an after effect, so that the periodization is less sharp than these years suggest. But what made this period so special? Interpretations vary widely, but historians generally point out that capitalism in the North Atlantic underwent a number of important changes in the early 20th century. The First World War is often mentioned as a turning point, exactly the period when Lenin was also writing. I only mention here briefly the social democratic theory of organized capitalism, developed by Rudolf Hilferding from 1915, the communist theory of state monopoly capitalism, authors emphasizing Fordism, authors who see corporatism as the most important characteristic, etc. I cannot evaluate all these theories here, but they agree that in the early decades of the last century, there have been major changes in the structure of advanced capitalism. And after about half a century, it became clear that the new form of capitalism was coming to an end. People spoke then of the crisis of Fordism or the end of organized capitalism. So it seems the general crisis Lenin spoke of in 1916 was interrupted for half a century. But in the meantime, the balance of power between capital and labor changed dramatically. Around 1916-21, the inevitable decline of capitalism seemed to have begun while workers' movements grew significantly in strength and revolutionary possibilities. From the 1980s onwards, however, the decline of capitalism is beginning to take hold again, but this time the workers' movements have weakened and the revolutionary possibilities seem slim for the time being. So we now face a double crisis, not only a crisis of capitalism, but also a crisis of the workers' movements. So in any case, Lenin's theory of the general crisis must be re-examined. Lenin certainly had no problem with that. He never hesitated to modify his positions whenever he deemed it necessary. Between 1893 and 1924, he changed his theoretical thoughts on, for instance, the agrarian question, the tactics of the proletarian party, the state and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and so on. And if he were alive today, I think he would certainly have reconsidered the theory of the generalized crisis. And it is now up to us to reanalyze socialist perspectives on a global scale. But now, this is all very pessimistic. Now let me end with some optimistic views. In the long run, things may not be as gloomy as they seem today. A number of factors may change, thus enabling a more optimistic future. Let me begin with a proof from the absurd. The weakening of the workers' movements has made it possible for other movements to appropriate a part of the sphere of activity of those missing workers' movements. Religious and nationalist movements partly fill the currently existing social void by deflecting class conflicts. They offer their supporters elementary forms of social security and trust networks, as well as self-esteem and clear life goals. Many poor people are drawn into such movements in all their variants. So, for instance, the Pentecostalist movements of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, Salafism in North Africa, the Middle East and Central Asia, and even precarious youth in capitalist industrial cities likewise appear now sometimes to be attracted to groups offering a new religious certainty. So these organizations use the space that has been left by the disappearing workers' movements, but they have to, at the same time, appeal to certain workers' interests. So that's also why some political scientists call the new right-wing populist parties, sociologically speaking, new workers' parties. The second thing is, of course, class conflict will not diminish, and workers all over the world will continue to feel the ever-present need for effective organizations and forms of struggle. I give you just a few examples of the last 2 years. For instance, on the strike front. The Hong Kong-based China Labor Bulletin collects strike data for the Chinese People's Republic. In its report for 2023, the magazine concluded, that's all free on the web, you can check yourself, concluded that there had been 1,794 incidents. That is the term they use in the People's Republic, which means usually strikes. And 1,794 incidents was more than double that of the year before. when there were 831 incidents. And the background here is the current recession, which has also hit China. The editors note, I quote, "The high youth unemployment rate has led more university students to accept unemployment or seek part-time jobs and other means to make ends meet. As for those workers who were directly laid off and whose benefits were reduced, many more launched strikes and protests." And then comes a certain, very important sentence. "Under such circumstances, Chinese workers need trade unions that can represent them before and after rights are violated." I should add here that in China there is a trade union organization. It's the largest trade union organization of the world, the All China Union, which has 300 million members, but that's not a trade union because they hardly ever strike. If they strike only in foreign firms, and they are more a transmission belt of the party leadership. Now let's move to another superpower, the United States. There we have also seen a resurgence, 15 minutes, that's more than enough. In the United States, we see also a resurgence of collective action among workers. The University of Cornell has a labor action tracker, and they counted for 2023 354 strikes in the United States with about 500,000 workers. And this was nearly 8 times the number of workers involved in strikes in 2021 and nearly 4 times the number for 2022. So you see an enormous increase in strikes. Mass protests, of course, took also place in Europe, for example, in France, between January and June 23, against the pension reform by the Brenner government, huge public transport strikes in Germany and the Spanish state, among others. In India, in 2022, the year before, more than 200 million workers joined the 2 days national strike in March in protest of the government's anti-worker, anti-farmer, and anti-people protests. In Vietnam, a wave of wildcat strikes erupted in 2005, and that wave reached its high point in 2011, but is still going on. So you see a lot of militancy across the globe. Thirdly, we should not forget that the global labor force is larger and more interconnected than ever before. The number of employees, wage earners, worldwide increased from 2.3 billion in 1991 to 3.6 billion in 2022. So an increase of about 1.2 billion people. Simultaneously, enormous shifts are taking place within separate regions. A historic migration from the countryside to swelling megacities is underway, as we know. In 1960, the total number of international migrants worldwide was 72 million. By 2015, it had become 243 million, so 3 times more. And internal migrations within countries have also become much more significant. In 2000, the National Bureau of Statistics of the People's Republic of China estimated that there were 130 million rural migrant workers in the country, and 20 years later, this had expanded to 376 million. Fourth and last point, there are also explicit signs of renewal. Organizing drives for previously unorganized workers in hospitals and the care sector in general have been increasing over the past few years. Very important is the rise of the International Domestic Workers Network since 2009. And this Domestic Workers Network campaigned very successfully and convinced the International Labour Organization to adopt a convention, Convention 189, on decent work for domestic workers. That was in 2011, and this has been an inspiration for many domestic workers across the world. Another thing is the strike wave that took place in the United States in prisons. You know, in the military-industrial, the prison-industrial complex in the United States, where, like in China, by the way, the inmates have to produce goods for the industry. For instance, Toys R Us, if you know that place things, this is all made in prison. So they started to strike, and here the syndicalist industrial workers of the world were organizing very effectively. In many countries, trade unions are trying to open up to informal and illegal workers. In recent years, for instance, in Uganda, the Ugandan Amalgamated Transport and General Workers Union succeeded in affiliating a mass membership of informal transport workers. So they grew in a few years' time from 3,000 to 100,000 members. Quite spectacular is in India, the new trade union initiative, founded in 2006, which recognizes the importance of both paid and unpaid women's work. It attempts to organize not only the formal sector, but also contract workers, casual workers, household workers, self-employed, and so on. It's also remarkable that in many places in the world we see a reinvention of forms of organization that played a major role in the early classical labor movements. For instance, mutual aid funds, mutuo socorro organizations. So people put together money in a box for in case somebody gets ill or becomes unemployed, and then he or she can get money out of this box. It's a form of self-protection that dates back to the 18th century at the latest, and is now being reintroduced by precarious and informal workers in many countries. Also noteworthy are the housing cooperatives and the small consumer co-ops, so for instance the solidarity purchase groups, which have seen the light since the 90s in several countries. But we can also think of new types of cooperatives that build on older models, for instance, energy production cooperatives. So you see a lot of activity going on, but it's just not articulated through permanent workers' organizations. So let me conclude. We are confronted with two crises, the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of workers' movements. The dictionary defines a crisis as follows: the turning point of a disease when an important change takes place, indicating either recovery or death. So a crisis is a tipping point. And you can always, after a crisis, you can have a revival and become better than you have ever been, but you can also die. So nobody can be certain that capitalism will once more revive. And neither is it impossible that the workers' movements regain their vitality, and this would obviously have direct consequences for the development of capitalism. Thank you.
Well, as we do have some few minutes left before starting with the questions, would you like to add something, Robert?
Well, I think probably the best way to further the conversation would be, from my point of view, would be to have new entrants, so to speak, to raise the level and give us a new new perspectives, really, or different ones from the ones that the two of us are offering. Not that the two of us are offering the same perspective, although I have to say I found Marcel's presentation very powerful. It was not my first response was not to be upset about it and to jump in, but to and I want to learn more about that. So, for me, I would be. Usually this is very uncharacteristic of me. If I get a chance to talk, I waste the time. But at this moment, I think. Let me just it's so unnatural to me to actually give up a chance to blab on. I would just say one small point, and it's really just, and so I'm a little reluctant to even make the point. It's not really a response to Marcel. It's just a further elaboration of the kind of things I was trying to say, which was that the difficulty of the so-called problem of, you know, the tendency to financialization, you know, which really continued to flower, I would say, certainly to 2009. I think it's an interesting question. What happened after the great financial crisis of 2007 to 9? But I think that the sort of lesson of this evolution is the willingness to use political means to redistribute away, you know, away from those parts, you know, elements in the economy which are problems for profits. And so profits are falling. This makes it obviously difficult for financial firms because it makes it difficult for firms in the real economy. So you end up, at least for a period of a kind of ganging up on all elements who are going to be from which profits are taken rather than given. So, you know, above all, what we're talking about is a shift from below, from workers to capitalists. But interestingly, I would just say there's one small final point. There's also a critically important, and I just hesitate to raise it because it's so kind of expansive and far-reaching, is that the other, in addition to upward redistribution of income from labor to capital, you all know about this, you have the upward redistribution of income from the less powerful to the more powerful capitalists, and this tends to be not only big, organized capitalists, but that what begins to happen, or what becomes the central driving force of the economy, from the 80s on, is a politicization of the economy. So quickly, you have in the 70s, beginning of an all-out attack on the working class that goes on forever. At the same time, you have Keynesian demand management, because the economy is in difficulty because profits have fallen, investment has fallen, and you need to improve the conditions for investment. So, of course, these are contradictory because you're undercutting demand in order to solve the problem. Your austerity and many other possibilities are then added to, I suppose, by redistributions within firms. And I'll just mention one, which is the way in which, shockingly, at the highest levels of the financial firms, the top financial managers are able to fashion institutional arrangements for their businesses, which essentially exacerbate the separation between their profit making and the productive potentials of the firm. You know what happens within the financial firms, Wall Street firms, is that their participation in the support of the real economy, so to speak, is made ever more insulated from the market. So you have, and I think everyone's all familiar with this, but you have the, and it was talked about this morning, very elegantly. You have attempts by top managers no longer to take returns in proportion to their investment or anything like that. What they want to do is politically guarantee a piece of the action, no matter what the outcome is. And you see within the firms a series of institutional changes that shockingly allow this, and you see similarly changes within the political life of the United States, in which all participants within the political game are oriented in the same way. Unions. I just lost a little bit my chain of thought, but the idea being that the way forward for everyone is as before, to see that what's good for General Motors is good for everyone. But the small catch is that the logic of what's good for everyone, for General Motors is good for everyone, is, in quote, the expanding capitals of the post-war period, profits for General Motors made for accumulation by General Motors, blah, 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 and made demand and in interest by General Motors in expanded production. So that ultimately meant growing, on the one hand, growing demand for labor and higher returns to workers. At the same time, expanding pie meant that capitalist profits could be protected while allowing higher tax returns. So win-win, that whole thing. And I think it's, I think it's important to see there was a, very important element of truth to that. But once the economy begins to contract in the 70s, this connection between creating the conditions for capital accumulation and what's good for everyone, that begins to break down, because what you're now talking about is much more, rather than having conditions created for General Motors or whatever to make better profits, and in turn, because of the competitive nature of the system, General Motors to invest, or any of the element in the quote real economy to invest. Because of the difficulties of making profits, that there is a break in that natural circle, and quote, and so that profits inducing policies internal to firms and internal to the state that lead to higher profits do not lead in turn to capital accumulation. So there's a break in the action, and it's this that, allows people like myself to, get people to pay attention to what you're saying by talking about, a transition from capitalism to feudalism. But really what we're talking about is the logical, extension of capitalist logic, which always puts profits first, makes profits dependent on accumulation, but because it's a private profit making, there's no way to assure that that profit making in turn leads to accumulation. And that break in that circle is kind of what we've all lived through for the last 40 years.
I have also something to say about Bob's.
If it's briefly.
Well, if I can have as much time as Bob, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, but I don't need so much time. I wanted to say we could perhaps see the whole financialization thing in a broader context also as what I would call a return to merchant capital. So traditionally we think merchant capital was first, and then out of merchant capital grew industrial capital. We can read all this in Capitals in Marx's writings. But now it seems as if we see a return to this earlier form, but at a much higher technical level. So I give you three examples. One is the increasing use of the Verlag system, the outsourcing. For instance, Volkswagen has a factory built in Resende near Rio, where they build trucks and buses. And so they built a building, and they gave machines and so there. And then they appointed a consortium of 6 firms, subcontractors, and they produce everything. And so what Volkswagen then does is, at the end, check whether the buses are okay. And then Volkswagen sells them. So this is exactly the same system, but then at a high technological level as in the 18th century or so, when, a putting out system where a textile merchant would bring wool or so to a peasant family, and they would then make textiles out of it, and then they would pick it up again and pay. And you see this in many cases. I could go on a very long time for this, but I'm not allowed to do this. So that is one thing. This is the return of Verlag, so of outsourcing. The second thing is that we see an enormous increase of the power of merchant capital firms. So for instance, the Fortune 500, every year is published. The last year, for instance, a few months ago, you could see that the largest firms are Walmart, which is a supermarket chain with the largest employer in the world. Then you have IKEA, who also doesn't produce anything itself, but also has all kinds of subcontractors and so on. And then you have a few, the Aramco, the Arab oil company also. But it's a shift. If you compare this with 50 years ago, when industrial firms and oil firms like Esso, but also car companies especially, Ford and General Motors and so, were in the top of the largest firms. So within the world capitalist class, you see a shift from of power from industrial to merchant capital. And the final thing is, of course, the rise of financial capital. So what Marx would call rent-seeking or money capital and so on. So, and all these things seem to indicate this return to an earlier stage, but in a different form, of course. And we have to think more about that.
Well, thank you. You were brief, so there was no problem at all. Before opening up the questions to the audience, I would like to ask you a few questions, just a pair of them. Well, you have talked about historical trends of...
Talking about, I didn't hear what you said.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No. You talked a lot about historical trends of capital accumulation. But I would like to know a little bit more about what you think about the current context or the post-2007, 8, 9 crisis context. Especially, I'm speaking about moderating growth in the West, European economies in decline. You have spoken now about financialization, about recent transformations mainly in the West's economy. Okay, so what forms of class struggle or what political forms can be created from the current situation in Europe or in the West?
Political forms, what do you mean?
What forms of class struggle? Does this new capital accumulation cycle post 2008 crisis open new forms of class struggle? Does it not?
Open new forms of class
struggle.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you wish, you can talk about this. Yeah.
I'm not going to say much about it. I'll let Marcel.
I have my own mic here.
Oh, take over here. But it seems like you had the just one small element has been the truly blatant willingness of political authorities at all levels, starting at the level of governments, to blatantly support the state, which is necessarily at the expense of workers. And so I think I don't know whether we can be optimistic or not about what happens, but we can be certain that what happened in 2007 to 9 will be exacerbated. That is a kind of blatant turn to support capital at the expense of labor. So, what becomes, overriding is the bailout. And because, as I think both Marcel and I were trying to say, because in this condition where profit-making becomes so much more difficult, the sort of most obvious point of political entry or political intervention is at the highest levels. And so you have a remerger of state and economy at the highest level, so that redistribution is not so much going on in order to, isn't able to go on to assure profit-making leading to accumulation and employment. It's just M-M1 without the business of production, sale, and in the middle. So I think that's what we saw in the financial crisis of 2007 and 9. And you have people, very interesting, you have people like Alan Blinder, who people may remember is a leading participant in the American financial sector in the state. And Blinder just can't believe how blatant and how sort of unvarnished and unmediated, or unqualified is really the term, the way in which money goes to the corporations. No mediation, through improved possibilities for capital accumulation, just rip off. And this is the justification, I think, for which I don't think is the way to go, but I think there is a kind of attractiveness of talking about political forms that previously we thought of as feudal or absolutist, and which ends up with very close merger of the state and economic leadership. I mean, I would like to hear Marcel or anyone else talk about the relationship, the way in, sort of the way in which, or the way not in which, say, the fascist economy, or above all the Nazi economy, were about facilitating M-M without the need for much in the way of justification by means of production, but which are all about ever more powerful political intervention, not to support capital accumulation, but to directly transfer money from working class to the capitalist class, countless ways that has been going on, and I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, you meant only Europe, or you meant the whole world?
I think there is a big difference between the West and the so-called periphery, or
Yeah.
So my question was focused on Europe or the West.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there are some, what we can do is specify the preconditions for a revival, I think, of workers' organizations. There will be class struggle anyway. That's, as I said, is inevitable. But one thing we see, of course, an increasing precarianization. More and more people do not have a steady job. They jump from one employment to another. Sometimes they're self-employed. And the current trade union methods do not fit that situation, because collective bargaining is based on the assumption that workers work for a number of years with the same employer, while precarious workers have maybe every other week another employer, or they have two employers at the same time, or three. So collective bargaining in the traditional form is not fit for organizing and defending the interests of precarious workers. So here we would need a much more creative approach. And for instance, we can learn something from the third world there, if that's ancient term I can use. For instance, the Ugandan organization, which grew so famously, that could maybe an inspiration. There are more of these examples. Then, of course, I mentioned already the return of, say, older forms of organization, like the societies for mutual help, but we also have all kinds of cooperatives and other kinds of interest organizations, housing cooperatives also. That would be a thing. And then, of course, the trade unions, or the workers' movements in general, should try to connect with all kinds of different struggles. So not just wages and so, the economistic struggle, but also ecological issues, women's issues, migrant issues, and so on. And then, especially in the field of migrants, trade unions are often quite reactionary. So there's a lot to change there. And then let me say a final thing here, and that is, there's a book by Jörg Nowak. It's a German-Brazilian political scientist who compared class struggle in Brazil and India, so not Western Europe. But he showed that there are enormous strikes possible without a trade union. As long as people have other sources of income, for instance, they have a home village where they are supported from, and so on. That's another thing. And finally, about what you said about the Nazis, there's a book by a man called Götz Ali,
What's the last name?
Ali, the Arab Ali, but then with,
No.
with the Greek Ali. Anyway, and he argues that the expansion of Germany in the Second World War and the robberies that took place in Eastern Europe especially contributed significantly to the German prosperity in those years.
Very efficiently done.
They did it very efficiently, and well, soldiers often could keep part of the loot and so, but there was a whole discussion whether this would be enough to explain the economic growth in Germany in those years, and that's probably not the case, but still, it was M-M in a way. Okay.
Okay, so as we have 10 minutes, more or less, if someone in the audience wants to add something, comment something, ask something, you now have the opportunity.
You agree with everything we said, isn't it?
And of course, the alternative is you can leave, you can get out quicker, or you know.
Okay, so they indeed agree with everything. So.
No questions then? Wolf?
Well,
Okay. Yeah. He's bringing to you.
I've learned a lot of the presentations. Thank you very much for this. But I have a few phenomena which I want to be introduced in your picture of the whole thing. Yeah? For instance, what we all have lived in our everyday life is what is called financial repression. That is, I think, in my experience, about 40% or 30-something% of my income has been annihilated in the last 2 years via inflation. And this is a technology regularly applied. Maybe she could be introduced into the image. And the other aspect, I mean, we are in the middle of a storm of development of forces of production, productivkräfte, las fuerzas de producción, ¿no? Es una evolución tremenda de fuerzas de producción. Todos hablan de digitalización, de inteligencia artificial. Eso no es nuevo. Desde tal vez los 80 del siglo XX ha empezado con la automatización, pero ahora salta en nuevos niveles de calidad, de cantidad. ¿Y cómo se puede introducir en ese porque eso transforma el mundo laboral radicalmente. Por ejemplo, de momento tenemos los que aprovecharon los últimos años 100.000 a la calle. Porque se dice, porque ahora la inteligencia artificial está, ya no necesitamos vosotros. Porque esa puede hacer vuestro trabajo fuera. Pero eso solo... y aquí entra otra categoría que también me parece importante. Por ejemplo, leyendo Lenin de hace 100 años, de los 20 del siglo pasado, la categoría de aristocracia proletaria o de labor aristocracy or the workers aristocracy, I don't know how to say that, Arbeiteraristokratie in German. Also, I would be interested to have introduced these categories, this split enormous. This is the elite of the IT personnel was an example. This is workers' aristocracy, but now in the streets, thousands and thousands, like the bankers after 2008. In London, how many bankers on the street? It may be one more aspect, the war. We have war economy now. We have war profits. We have a redistribution of profitability between the different sectors. All this changes the conditions of organizing labor of our projects. So maybe this is what happens now, just now. I think it would be worthwhile to introduce some of these parameters, maybe in the total picture of the situation. This means the conditions of organizing workers and of a refoundation of socialist organization, as you do here.
Thank you.
Sum it up because I didn't hear it.
Oh, well,
If you could
three topics Wolfgang Fritz mentioned. Financial repression, including inflation, which is hurting him terribly. Second thing is labor aristocracy. And the third one is the war economy, all kinds of factors which contribute to shifting class relations. I could maybe just say something about the labor aristocracy, because we are here on a Lenin conference, and in 1907, Lenin at the Stuttgart conference of the Second International argued that in the rich countries, the whole working class had become a labor aristocracy, and that the workers of England, for instance, but also of Germany, were all profiting from the exploitation of the workers in the global south. I think that he was right, and that we have paid insufficient attention to that problem. It can be shown that over the course of time, and especially after the Second World War, an increasing percentage of the income of workers in the north is based on the exploitation of workers in the south. Not that the workers in the north are not exploiting the workers in the south, but the fact that they have cheap T-shirts, that they have all kinds of cheap mobile phones and whatever, is to a significant extent based on the fact that wages or working conditions in general are very bad in parts of the global south. And one of the main tasks for a socialist movement, I think, would be to attack this. So, for instance, if I talk about my mobile phone, there's cobalt in it, and copper, and coltan, and these come mostly from Congo. And the working conditions there are terrible, as we know. If the workers in Congo would organize, then they would control a commodity chain that would lead to Samsung and so on, but would force these big multinationals to change their policies and to improve their labor conditions. The problem is, of course, that these workers in Congo do not know about commodity chains, and that it's not very difficult to organize them because any organizer will be shot. So, but the point is, there is here a very fundamental injustice, which is much more important than wage differentials within the North, that needs to have be attacked, and that I think is a task for the international trade union movement, which it has neglected very much, and that should change. That's all I have to say now. But war economy is also all very important, but I cannot say much about it because I didn't think about it enough.
Okay, so no time left. Just a few things, a couple of things. Bueno, igual lo digo en castellano, lo entendemos todos mejor. Por favor, cuando salgáis, dejad estos cacharros, los receptores en la entrada, donde los habéis cogido.
I had already forgotten.
Y la segunda cosa, estad puntual a -15, 15 minutos de descanso para poder empezar a tiempo la